73 seconds. That's all it took for a mission of hope to turn into one of the darkest chapters in space history. In classrooms across America, children sat glued to the screen, waiting for their teacher's first lesson from orbit. Instead, they witnessed fire and silence. What followed was even more chilling. Evidence later suggested the crew may have survived the initial breakup. And when the ocean finally surrendered the remaining parts of the Challenger, investigators uncovered details far more disturbing than anyone could imagine. The truth of Challenger's final moments and the fate of its crew remains darker and more haunting than the world was ever told. The deadly mission. On January 28, 1986, the world stood still for what was supposed to be a moment of triumph. The mission was the 25th flight of the Space Shuttle program and the 10th time the Shuttle Challenger had been prepared for launch. By then, the Shuttle program had already become a symbol of America's future in space, and this launch was supposed to open the door for something far bigger. The Challenger's crew was about to make history. The mission was built around the idea of deploying a satellite and conducting experiments in orbit. That alone was important, but this flight carried something no mission before it had ever done. It carried the first civilian teacher, Christa McAuliffe, chosen by NASA to inspire a new generation. Christa wasn't just a name on a list. She was a high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who had been selected out of more than 11,000 applicants for NASA's Teacher in Space project. The idea was brilliant. Put a teacher in orbit and let them teach lessons live from space, broadcasting straight into classrooms across America. For NASA, it was a way to spark wonder in children and renew public excitement in the shuttle program. For Christa, it was the adventure of a lifetime. She was supposed to show that space wasn't just for military pilots and scientists, it could be for regular people too. The crew of this mission was carefully assembled. At the top was Francis R. Scobee, the mission commander. Scobee was a Vietnam veteran, a test pilot, and one of NASA's most trusted astronauts. Sitting beside him was Michael J. Smith, the shuttle pilot, making his very first spaceflight. Along with them were three experienced mission specialists: Ronald McNair, a physicist who had already flown before, Judith Resnick, an electrical engineer who had previously been on Challenger, and Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American astronaut, also on his second space mission. The seventh member was Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist, representing Hughes Aircraft. And then, of course, there was Christa McAuliffe, the civilian who was about to make history. This group of seven were faces the public had grown to know. Newspapers, television, and radio all covered their training and their stories. McAuliffe, especially, was in the spotlight. She gave interviews, smiled for cameras, and told school children across the country that she would be bringing them along for the ride. Kids were asked to gather in classrooms on launch day to watch. For many, it would be the first time they ever saw a live space launch. Training for the mission had lasted months. Every member of the crew underwent long simulations that tested everything from how to handle emergencies to how to manage the shuttle's payloads. Christa McAuliffe, despite being a civilian, was put through astronaut training as well. She learned how to work in zero gravity, practiced with shuttle simulators, and trained in water tanks to prepare for the strange environment of space. The press loved to cover her progress, turning her into something of a national celebrity. Behind the scenes, though, NASA was under pressure. Delays had pushed back the mission again and again. Originally, Challenger was supposed to launch earlier in January 1986, but weather and technical issues caused postponements. The date was moved several times. By the time January 28 rolled around, the crew had been waiting for days, enduring the tension of repeated scrubs and reschedules. Finally, the morning of the launch arrived. The conditions at Cape Canaveral, Florida, were anything but ordinary. It was one of the coldest mornings in shuttle history. Temperatures had dropped below freezing, something rarely seen in Florida. Icicles hung from the launch pad. Engineers and managers debated whether it was safe to launch. There had been concerns about the O-rings, the rubber seals inside the solid rocket boosters. At low temperatures, these O-rings could stiffen, making them unable to properly seal. Several engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the boosters, voiced strong warnings about the risks, but those warnings never made it far enough up the decision chain to stop the countdown. By dawn, thousands of people had gathered near Cape Canaveral to watch the shuttle take off. Parents brought their children. Reporters crowded the press area. Hundreds of students who followed Christa McAuliffe's journey were watching eagerly from their classrooms. Millions more tuned in on live television. It was one of the most widely anticipated launches NASA had ever staged. The presence of a teacher on board had turned the launch into a global media event. NASA framed it as a moment that would blend education with exploration. Cameras focused on Christa, waving to the crowd as she boarded the shuttle. She wore the same blue NASA flight suit as the other astronauts, blending in as a crew member but standing out as a symbol of what was supposed to be possible. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the countdown hit 0. Challenger roared to life, its main engines blasting out flames, its solid rocket boosters shaking the ground. The shuttle began to rise slowly, building speed as it climbed higher into the sky. The crowd erupted in cheers. Parents pointed upward. Teachers in classrooms told their students to pay close attention. This was history in the making. The moment was electrifying. On television, announcers described the shuttle clearing the tower. The cameras followed as Challenger streaked higher, a bright white plume trailing behind it. Everything seemed normal. The crew inside were strapped in, riding the vibration and noise, holding steady as the shuttle made its way into the upper atmosphere. But beneath the excitement, hidden from the cheering crowds, was the danger that engineers had feared. The O-rings inside the right solid rocket booster had not sealed properly. Hot gases began to leak out, burning through the booster joint. Nobody in the crowd knew it. Nobody in mission control saw it at first. To everyone watching, the shuttle appeared to be flying perfectly. But 73 seconds into flight, all that changed, and in an instant, hope turned to horror. The devastating accident. In NASA's timekeeping language, the moment everything went wrong is called T plus 73 seconds, which simply means 73 seconds after launch. Up until that point, Challenger had climbed steadily into the Florida sky, the crowd below still cheering, the millions watching on television unaware of the danger that was building. The first sign of trouble was invisible to most eyes. The right solid rocket booster had a small opening where its rubber seal, called an O-ring, had failed to close properly. The O-ring was supposed to expand under pressure and block any gas from escaping, but the freezing weather on launch day had made the rubber too stiff. Instead of sealing, it allowed superheated exhaust to escape, and that hot gas burned directly into the side of the external fuel tank. Inside that huge orange tank was liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, the fuel that powered the shuttle's main engines. As the flames from the leaking booster grew, they weakened the structure of the tank. At 73 seconds into the flight, the external tank ruptured. In an instant, it released a massive cloud of explosive fuel. The sight from the ground looked like an explosion, a giant fireball tearing across the sky. But technically, Challenger didn't explode in the way a bomb would. What happened was a sudden structural breakup caused by aerodynamic forces ripping the vehicle apart as the tank failed. The fireball that cameras captured was the result of the tank's liquid fuel igniting in the open air. Pieces of Challenger scattered against the clear blue sky. Viewers on the ground gasped in confusion. Teachers in classrooms struggled to explain to their students what they had just witnessed. Television commentators at first didn't even know what to say. Some thought the shuttle had separated stages, the way a rocket might normally do. But within seconds, it was clear. Challenger had disintegrated. The crew cabin, the white forward section where all 7 astronauts were seated, broke free from the rest of the shuttle. Against the chaos of flying debris, the cabin actually remained intact. It continued to rise upward on momentum, climbing to nearly 48,000 feet before it began to fall. Engineers later determined that the cabin stayed structurally sound during the entire descent. It didn't shatter in the breakup. Instead, it fell as one solid piece. The fall lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. From that altitude, the cabin dropped silently, powerless, until it struck the ocean below. There was no parachute system designed for such a scenario. NASA had never equipped the shuttle with a way to recover the cabin. The impact with the Atlantic was violent and unsurvivable. For years, many assumed that the crew had died instantly in the breakup. but evidence later revealed something more complicated. Emergency oxygen systems inside the cabin showed signs of use. At least some of the crew members had activated their packs. This means they were alive, at least for part of the fall. It suggests that in those 2 minutes and 45 seconds, some level of awareness existed inside the cabin. What they experienced is unknown. Communication had already been lost, and no signals came from the cabin after the breakup. But the oxygen evidence was enough to suggest that death had not been immediate. The images of Challenger's destruction spread across the world within minutes. News outlets replayed the footage again and again, the plume of smoke in the sky becoming one of the most haunting images in modern history. Children who had been watching in their classrooms sat in stunned silence. Teachers who had gathered them to witness a triumph suddenly had no words. The excitement of seeing Christa McAuliffe teach from space was replaced by grief and confusion. At NASA's Mission Control in Houston, flight controllers froze in shock. The flight controllers were informed of the problem, but the truth was already clear. There would be no rescue. The shuttle was gone, the crew lost. The nation went into mourning. That evening, President Ronald Reagan addressed the country in a televised speech. He spoke of the 7 crew members as heroes, praising their courage and their dedication to exploration. His words were meant to comfort, but the shock ran deep. The United States had never seen a tragedy unfold, live in front of so many people. Investigations began immediately, and all shuttle flights were halted. NASA grounded the program while experts tried to understand what had gone wrong. Families of the crew grieved under the full glare of the media. The disaster was not just a national tragedy, it was deeply personal, as millions felt they had known the crew, especially Christa McAuliffe. The Challenger accident was unlike anything the space program had faced before. It wasn't just the loss of a shuttle, it was the loss of 7 people the public had watched board that spacecraft, smiling and waving. It was a disaster seen in real time by school children across America. The impact of that moment would shape the shuttle program for years to come. But even as the world mourned, a grim task began. Out in the Atlantic Ocean, the search for the crew and the wreckage was already underway. The recovery operation. The moment Challenger broke apart, debris began raining down over the Atlantic Ocean. Some fragments of the shuttle fell close to shore, but most plunged into the sea, sinking rapidly to the ocean floor. What followed was one of the largest and most difficult recovery operations in American history. The U.S. Navy and the Coast Guard were immediately called into action. Within hours, ships, helicopters, and divers were dispatched to search the waters east of Cape Canaveral. The ocean became the focus of a desperate hunt, not only for debris, but also for any chance, however slim, that someone from the crew cabin had survived. Those hopes faded quickly. Engineers knew what the impact with the ocean meant. The crew cabin had fallen unprotected from miles above, striking the surface at over 200 miles per hour. That kind of impact was not survivable. The search zone was massive, stretching across hundreds of square miles. The explosion had scattered fragments of the shuttle in all directions, from tiny shards of tile to large, twisted sections of the boosters and tank. Recovery teams worked around the clock, battling currents, poor visibility, and the sheer size of the debris field. For weeks, Navy ships dragged sonar equipment across the seabed, trying to locate the largest pieces. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the surface for floating wreckage. Smaller boats darted back and forth to haul in anything spotted drifting in the waves. The sight of what came up from the water was haunting. Charred metal, scorched insulation, and recognizable pieces of the shuttle were pulled onto ships. Each piece was cataloged and carefully stored. Some were taken to hangars at Cape Canaveral, where investigators began reconstructing the shuttle like a puzzle, trying to understand exactly what had happened in those final seconds. But the most painful part of the recovery came with the search for the crew cabin. The Navy devoted enormous resources to this task. Specialized salvage ships equipped with deep-sea diving gear scoured the ocean floor. Divers went down in pressurized suits, facing cold, dark conditions as they searched the wreckage. The work was slow and dangerous, but it was necessary. The families of the crew and the nation needed answers. When the remains of the crew were finally located, the operation became even more secretive. The Navy and NASA coordinated to recover the cabin fragments and whatever was left inside. The recovery was handled with extreme care, shielded from public view out of respect for the astronauts and their families. Helicopters carried sealed containers back to shore, where the remains were transferred to military bases for examination. Forensic identification was led by teams of specialists. Dental records played a key role in identifying individual astronauts. In some cases, DNA testing was used, though the technology was still in its early stages in the mid-1980s. The process was slow and emotionally devastating, but it ensured that the remains of each crew member could eventually be returned to their families. The biomedical investigation was led by Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a former astronaut and physician. His team studied the condition of the remains and the evidence inside the crew cabin to try to determine what had happened in those final minutes. The results were sobering. NASA's final report concluded that the exact causes of death could not be determined. The impact with the ocean was catastrophic, and that alone was enough to ensure there were no survivors. But Kerwin's team also considered other possibilities: rapid depressurization inside the cabin, loss of oxygen, or trauma from the breakup itself. The oxygen packs that had been activated suggested that at least some of the crew had been alive and functioning after the breakup, but whether they remained conscious during the fall was impossible to prove. The descent lasted nearly 3 minutes, but unconsciousness from loss of pressure could have occurred within seconds. The official conclusion left it uncertain, a haunting unknown that added to the tragedy. While recovery teams worked at sea, the nation turned its attention to the investigation on land. President Ronald Reagan appointed a special panel known as the Rogers Commission, led by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. The commission was charged with finding out why Challenger had been lost. Members included astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, as well as physicist Richard Feynman, who would become one of the most outspoken voices during the inquiry. At the same time, NASA carried out its own internal investigation. Panels of engineers and safety experts studied the wreckage, reviewed launch data, and interviewed personnel who had been part of the mission. The Wright solid rocket booster, with its charred and eroded O-ring joint, provided the clearest evidence. It confirmed what some engineers had feared. The cold weather had made the O-ring brittle, and it had failed to seal. That failure led directly to the destruction of Challenger. The Rogers Commission delivered its report in June 1986. It was blunt in its findings. It stated that the O-ring failure had been the technical cause of the disaster, but it also criticized NASA's decision-making and management culture. Concerns from engineers had not been properly communicated or acted upon. Launch pressures and a desire to maintain schedules had taken priority over safety. The commission called for sweeping changes in how NASA handled shuttle missions. NASA's own reports echoed these findings and emphasized the urgent need for better safety protocols. Every part of the shuttle program was examined. The design of the boosters was overhauled. Procedures for evaluating risks were rewritten. The shuttle fleet was grounded for more than 2 years as changes were made. Back in Florida, the recovery operation stretched into April. By the time it ended, nearly every major piece of Challenger that could be found had been brought to shore. Thousands of fragments filled storage hangars, some of them later buried in abandoned missile silos to keep them out of public view. The remains of the crew had been returned to their families, allowing funerals and memorial services to be held. The work of recovery was over, but the shadow of the disaster remained. And as the official reports were finalized and the investigation continued, attention turned to one of the most sensitive parts of the story: how the remains of the crew were handled after they were recovered. How the remains were handled. Once the wreckage of Challenger in the crew cabin was brought back from the Atlantic, the remains of the 7 astronauts had to be recovered, identified, and returned to their families. Every step was carried out with the highest level of sensitivity, guided not only by NASA, but also by the Department of Defense, which coordinated much of the effort behind closed doors. This was not a process shared openly with the public. The work was conducted under heavy confidentiality to protect the dignity of the crew and the privacy of their loved ones. Families were always consulted before details were released, and NASA took great care to make sure that no information came out in the press that could add to the grief. Even among those directly involved, only a small circle of specialists had access to the biomedical findings. The handling of the remains followed strict procedures. As soon as they were recovered at sea, they were placed in sealed containers and transported discreetly to military facilities. From there, forensic experts, pathologists, and dental specialists began the delicate work of identification. Every measure was taken to ensure accuracy and respect. Once identification was complete, the remains were returned to the families. NASA worked closely with each family to arrange funeral services according to their wishes. Some chose burial, others cremation. What united them all was the immense outpouring of grief and support from their communities and from the nation. Each astronaut was honored individually, remembered not only as a member of the Challenger crew, but also as a parent, a sibling, a friend, and a hero. Commander Francis R. Scobie was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, the final resting place for many of America's military leaders and astronauts. Beside him, Michael J. Smith, the shuttle pilot, was also buried at Arlington. Their graves stand in a place that symbolizes national service and sacrifice. Mission specialist Judith Resnick, the first Jewish American woman to travel to space, was cremated. Her ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location chosen by her family. She was remembered not only for her work as an engineer and astronaut, but also for her role in inspiring women in science and engineering. Physicist Ronald McNair was brought home to Lake City, South Carolina. Thousands attended his funeral, filling the small town with mourners who came to honor his life. McNair had been one of the first African-American astronauts, and his legacy was celebrated across the country. His burial in South Carolina became a moment of pride, as well as sorrow for his community. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American astronaut, was laid to rest in Hawaii. His funeral drew mourners from across the islands. For many, Onizuka represented the possibilities of reaching beyond cultural barriers, and his memory continues to inspire generations in Hawaii and across the Pacific. Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, whose seat on Challenger had originally been delayed from an earlier mission, was cremated. His family chose a private service. Jarvis had been an engineer representing Hughes Aircraft, and his dedication to his work was remembered both within the aerospace community and among those who knew him personally. Christa McAuliffe, the teacher whose journey had captivated the entire country, was returned to her hometown of Concord, New Hampshire. Her funeral was attended by family, friends, students, and dignitaries. She was buried there, surrounded by the community that had supported her from the start. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage for many who wanted to pay tribute to the teacher who had been chosen to carry the dreams of students into space. While each astronaut was honored individually, a collective memorial was also created. At Arlington National Cemetery, a monument dedicated to the Challenger crew stands as a symbol of their shared sacrifice. The stone bears their names, reminding visitors that their mission was carried out together and that they are remembered as one. The legacy of the crew was carried beyond cemeteries and memorials. The families themselves played a central role in ensuring that their loved ones would never be forgotten. Out of their grief, they founded the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, an organization designed to continue the mission of inspiring students. The center created interactive programs that allowed young people to engage with science and space in ways that honored Christa McAuliffe's dream of teaching from orbit. Through these centers, the Challenger crew continued to reach classrooms, not from orbit, but through education that carried forward their spirit. Across the United States, schools, streets, libraries, and public buildings were named after the Challenger astronauts. Children who grew up in the years after the disaster attended schools bearing names like McAuliffe, Onizuka, or Resnick. The astronauts became part of local communities, their stories told to each new generation. These names served as everyday reminders that exploration carries both inspiration and risk. At NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, a Challenger Memorial was established. Visitors to the Space Mirror Memorial can see the names of the crew etched in stone, along with others lost in the pursuit of spaceflight. It is a place of silence and reflection, where the enormity of the loss can be felt against the backdrop of launch pads that still send rockets skyward. The Challenger disaster also reshaped NASA itself. The agency instituted sweeping reforms in its safety protocols. Decision-making processes were restructured, and systems were redesigned to ensure that concerns could not be ignored. The O-ring failure and the culture that allowed the launch to proceed became a case study in the consequences of overlooking safety. The changes that followed were built on the memory of the Challenger crew, ensuring that their sacrifice led to a safer future for astronauts who would come after them. Every year, NASA pauses to remember. On the Day of Remembrance, the Challenger crew is honored alongside those lost in other space tragedies, including Apollo 1 and Columbia. The ceremonies are solemn, attended by families, astronauts, and NASA officials. Flowers are laid, names are read, and stories are retold. The tradition ensures that the crew of Challenger is not remembered only for how they died, but also for how they lived and what they contributed. The handling of the remains was only the first step in honoring them. What followed was a legacy built by families, communities, and the nation itself. Their graves, their memorials, and the institutions created in their names became lasting symbols. The story of Challenger did not end with the fireball in the sky or the wreckage in the Atlantic. It carried forward in classrooms, in scientific programs, and in the very way NASA approaches space exploration today. The 7 crew members of Challenger, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, were laid to rest with dignity, remembered with honor, and immortalized in ways that stretched far beyond their individual lives. Their mission ended in tragedy, but their influence continues to shape generations who look to the stars and dream of what lies beyond. Do you think the Challenger disaster could have been prevented? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you love juicy deep dives into celebrity lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new video.